The telecom regulator has decided to cut interconnect charges. In other words, telecom operators will now have to pay each other less for cross-network calls. The aim is to bring it down to 0 by 2020. Currently, it's been cut to 6 paise per call. Now, this is good news for new players such as Reliance Jio. But the three largest telecom players, the incumbent ones, Airtel, Idea and Vodafone, are crying foul as it's bound to hit their bottom line. The hope is, though, that call charges will get cheaper from here on for consumers and that the service provider will have to pay less to its peer. Joining us in studio to discuss this is telecom expert Sanjeev Aga, Jaideep Ghosh, partner at KPMG, also a telecom expert, and we're joined by Nitin Soni of Fitch Ratings on the phone line. To talk us through what he thinks the impact will be on the companies. Mr. Aga, let me start first with you. In a sense, your voice represents the anguish of incumbent players when we talk about why this move is negative for any of the incumbent players and positive only for Reliance Jio. But what I want to start by asking you is, have you fully understood, because I haven't, on what basis TRAI has decided to go from 14 paise to 6 paise?
You will have to ask Menika the question whether TRAI has fully understood the basis. I have, but let me first correct you. It is not incumbent versus new. This is the propaganda which is put out. It favors a particular kind of equipment which is used by one operator. So this business that it will bring down tariffs, that it is incumbent, this is old technology versus new technology, it has nothing to do with the matter. It will take me very long to explain it.
But in short, if you were able to tell us?
Well, basically, it will take me at least 60 seconds, but let me
no,
try.
60 seconds is more than fine, that's short.
You know, anytime there's a call, a voice call between, say, you and me,
right.
And if I happen to be, let's say, an Airtel
and I happen to be Vodafone.
Vodafone.
Okay.
Very roughly, the cost incurred to carry out the call, irrespective whether you call me or I call you, is very roughly half and half. But only one operator gets to collect the money.
Which is me if I'm terminating
the call. Yes, if you are making the call, then you are say Vodafone, you are billed by Vodafone. And the recipient operator who incurs half the cost of carrying the call gets nothing.
Okay.
So what they get is an interconnect charge from you. From the operator. So it keeps the consumers out of it, and it's an inter-operator settlement, and this is the heart of the 1984 regulation by which competition was introduced in AT&T in the United States.
Okay.
So the heart of regulation of IUC is that it must be equitable. Because any tilt in that, in one way or the other, is not a distortion, it can eliminate competition.
Okay.
And the tilts can happen in two ways. One, of course, is whether the cost is the right cost. And there are two ways of looking at cost. One is what is called the fully allocated cost, where you take direct and indirect costs, which is the real way. But in certain countries, very few countries, they take only incremental cost if they believe that there is no further investment to be made and the earlier investment has already been depreciated by way of IUC over the last 10-20 years. That stage obviously doesn't prevail in India. So the IUC should be close to the fully allocated cost logically. That's point number one. And point number two, any imbalance, even 1 paisa, can make a whopping difference in competitive survival. And therefore, there has to be guard bands of what is the level of incoming and outgoing traffic.
Okay.
Now, normal consumer behavior is 50s to 50. You know, it could be half and half. It could be 50
I make
to
half. I make 50 calls and I receive 50 calls.
That's normal. You know, on an average thing, it could become 52, 48. But the moment you have 10:1, which is what is happening right now, it is consumer calling behavior which has been induced opposite to natural consumer behavior because of aberrations or because of design of tariff plans.
So essentially what you're saying, if in simple English I can put this out, is that if I have a free voice calling plan, I'm more likely to make calls or make more calls than receive calls, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Now, if I may just take it, even when the tariff so far was 14 paisa, now take my word for it, you don't have to believe me, but let's assume that the cost of conducting the call and receiving a call is, let's say, 35 paisa, which is what some of the companies have held. You don't have to believe me, just take it for
But that's their argument,
as an assumption for the moment. Now, if you're going to make a call and if you're going to incur 14 paisa, and if you're making the other person inflict a loss of 21 paisa, and in the process destroy his business because also incoming outgoing pattern is getting distorted, you are actually finishing competition. So 14 paisa was already egregious given that there is an induced asymmetry of calling.
Right.
If it had been equal, it doesn't matter. But there is an induced asymmetry which is exploiting this arbitrage. Now, instead of correcting that, you either correct the IUC and take it higher, or you operate that only within certain limits of incoming outgoing. You do neither. You reduce it, and then you go on to project what may happen 2 years from now, which even unless you are divine, you do not know, and take it to zero based on assumptions about technology and markets. So it is an appalling decision, and it is a, if I may say so, in my this is my view. It was decided. It was decided. It's just been played out. The tamasha has been played out, and now you have it. I was expecting it because there were so many signs that this is where it is heading.
Okay, I want to bring Jaideep Ghosh into this conversation. Jaideep, you've just heard Sanjeev Aga explain the economics of the situation. Would you agree with him, and therefore would you believe that in setting the rate at 6 paise, the regulator has effectively skewed the playing field as opposed to leveling it?
See, in parts I tend to agree, but there are differences of my views vis-a-vis what Mr. Aga just now mentioned. So I think directionally it appears from a regulator's perspective in the right sense. The timing, both in terms of the announcement coming now and also mandating at this point of time that what will happen in 2020, which isn't too far away actually. That is something which is debatable. So let me quickly, very briefly explain both these points. Why do I say that directionally it makes sense? One is that from a regulator's perspective, the overall goals are linked to economic welfare, which means if you divide it in two parts, to keep it simple, one is to benefit customers, another was to boost competition. Now, to be honest, in Indian telecom industry, competition is anyway quite intense. So I don't think there are too many things that can be done by regulator to intensify the competition. On the other hand, customer benefiting, again price points and quality of calls and network etc. is definitely an issue. But from a pricing perspective, I think tariffs are fairly low and competitive. So there isn't too many things, there aren't too many things which the regulator can do at this point of time. So IUC is something which was there, which they could tweak little bit directionally to bring everything at equitable level. However, as was mentioned by Mr. Aga, the timing, both the situation in which the telecom industry is at this point of time, and I'm not detailing that, it's pretty much known, and the onslaught of competition, and the networks are different, voice over LTE, etc. And the incumbents having a tough time in managing their operations, and from a financial perspective, that is something looks like is debatable and is likely to be challenged. Also, mandating now that 2020 the traffic will be symmetric, as in more or less it will be all operators, all leading operators will have equal incoming and outgoing. That seems to be, and also that everybody will have same technology, etc. That seems to be something which is a bit premature to declare 2 years before. That's what my view is.
Jaideep, very quick follow-up question. You mentioned that this benefits consumers or is intended to benefit consumers, but almost all service providers have now moved to free calling plans, in which case I'm not paying anything as a consumer anyways for voice calls. So how does this stand to benefit me? The hit is taken only on the bottom lines of telecom service providers.
See, I don't expect that because of this, if this gets applicable 10 days from now, I do not see the tariffs coming down just because of this. Tariffs are anyway coming down because of competitive intensity and market pressures.
So what has the regulator achieved in this process? Because I'm already seeing as the consumer tariffs come down. In most cases, I'm seeing zero priced or absolutely free voice calls. You already spoke of hyper competitiveness in the industry that exists. So what is it that the regulator is attempting to achieve by reducing IUC at this point in time?
So All right, so a good point. So see, basically we are kind of now assuming that all operators have same technology platforms and the costs are same. That is not the case. That's what I think was hinted by Mr. Aga also. Most of the older operators have a fair bit of, a large part of their networks are kind of, roughly speaking, in a layman's language, 2G networks, whereas a certain operator has launched last year with a long-term evolution or a data kind of networks. So the older operators are incurring costs because their networks are and their users are, and still, in India, 75% of revenue comes from voice, in spite of all the data surge that we are seeing. So I think the older operators and incumbents do have a cost, which is not exactly being incurred by somebody who has all their calls routed over a data network. So the costs are also not equal.
Jaideep, that's a fair point. I want to put it to Sanjeev Aga. Sanjeev Aga, this is the only explanation I've heard in the last several weeks that we've been debating the IUC thing, that this will encourage operators to move to, a VoLTE or voice over LTE platform, and that's what the regulator hopes to be able to achieve, that as operators modernize their platforms, that this will become a level playing field. Would you agree?
No, I disagree on 2 points with Jaideep, factually.
Yeah.
And I don't blame him for holding it, because he's not as close to the scene as I was.
Sure.
Now, the first point is, this has nothing to do, as I said right in the beginning, with whether you have 2G equipment or 4G equipment. It is entirely what handset the consumer is using. So this whole business that, this is new technology, that is old technology. If you have got a 2G or a 3G handset, and if you don't have a VoLTE handset, or even if you have a VoLTE handset but have not, commissioned that feature or don't have that SIM, that call is terminated because of you, not because of the operator. The operator can very well terminate those calls on VoLTE if you upgrade your. So what is happening is that, this is a propaganda which has been used successfully to make it appear that the operators, incumbents, are hanging on to legacy equipment. It is entirely a function of serving the poorer customers, or if not poor, the laggard customers who've got older handsets. And that involves a cost which is very high, and you are not paying that cost because you're saying that, new technology. It is not the job of the regulator. It is specifically disallowed. Our regime is technology neutral. You cannot be pushing regulation in one particular. It is unwise to begin with, because you don't know which way science is going to go, and it is illegal in my opinion.
And we've seen this technology arbitrage play out.
Yeah. So,
15 years ago, when we saw the whole CDMA versus GSM situation, and lower license fees for CDMA till it was all equalized.
So unfortunately, even the so-called incumbent operators did not defend themselves because they got into old. It has nothing to do with the operators. It has to do with the consumer's handset. And if he's got a 2G handset and there is a cost, and then you're telling a person you incur that cost for free to benefit someone else, your rival, it is crazy. That's point number one. The point number two which Jaideep makes is that they're in the right direction. I want to point out a nuance, and I do not know if he'd agree with me but disagree with me, but again, just take my word for it for the moment. Let us say that if there was a divine power and it could calculate the correct IUC termination cost, let us say for the argument that it is 35 paisa per minute. Then if you are at 75 and you are tending down, then you are in the right direction, which is what the rest of the world is doing. No one in the world is less than 70-80 paisa. They are as high as 2 rupees with the same handsets and with the same technology. So, but if you are at 14 paisa and you are heading down, so to say that you are heading in the right direction, it depends. It's not as if you keep going in the right direction, tomorrow you will go to a minus direction. So this is what requires familiarity. You have to be closer to the actual cost to be able to make the point.
Very technical things.
So Jaideep is half right, but in the context in which I'm making this point, he's wrong.
Okay.
In my honest opinion.
Okay, Jaideep, you want to make a quick counter before I move on to Nitin Soni and get his view on what this means for the sector?
I mean, very quickly, and I think, we may not have time to debate this, but I think, parts of it I tend to agree, but just very, 10 seconds point, we are seeing, trends in, at least in European Union, because of high intra-EU roaming charges. The mobile termination charges have come down, we have seen in UK, and I'm sure there would be other countries where it has not come down, but by and large, trends I'm seeing is that it's kind of made far more reasonable. Ofcom in UK also has reduced it in spite of, the industry representations by almost 80 odd %. I don't remember exact number, but they did reduce it significantly, 5-6 years back. But I think let's hear the other speaker here as well.
Enough. So let's talk about the impact now on the telecom sector. Nitin, Soni of Fitch joining us to talk us through what this means for the various companies and their financials. Nitin, what's your view on the impact of this? Most of the brokerages that we've spoken to or have put out notes this morning have suggested that this is going to have an EBITDA hit for both Airtel as well as Idea. Vodafone is not listed in the country, so nobody refers to them in brokerage notes, but of course they will be impacted as well. And this will be a positive for Reliance Jio, will help advance Reliance Jio's break-even points.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Menika. So we believe that this is clearly credit positive for Reliance Jio and negative for the incumbents. So we are expecting that incumbents, including Bharti, Voda and Idea, they will see a decline in EBITDA of anywhere around 4 to 6% for financial year 2018, as it will be only a 6-month effect starting from October 2017. Overall, I think it could be a transfer of around, anywhere around $600 to $800 million from incumbents to Reliance Jio. Given overall on an industry basis, it's a zero-sum game, and it will clearly benefit Jio in terms of achieving EBITDA break even faster than our earlier expectations. And it's just a fact that during April to June 2017 quarter, Bharti received about $75 million in interconnection revenue just from Jio. So that will impact revenues for incumbents and positive for Jio.
Mr. Aga, so let's take that point forward. In the past, there have been a couple of instances where the incumbents have tried to challenge orders unsuccessfully, I might add. And while I think both the companies, Vodafone and Bharti, has issued a statement today, they will likely take a further course of action on this. Let's work with an assumption that the implementation does happen as per October 1st, and they are not able to challenge this successfully. What happens then? Because you are saying, in your first answer, I got a sense that you were trying to say that this will kind of destroy the industry. Is it as grave?
In the sense that, yes, but for a different, I'm coming from somewhere, I'm arriving at that point. If you have a regulated industry where there is an umpire, and if you believe that the umpire is going to be steadfastly find ways and means of favoring one to the exclusion of others, okay, then it doesn't start at this, it doesn't end with this, it's a series of measures, and they can land up anywhere. So, and this impact, in my assessment, is immediately for the telecom sector, and some people can feel good about it, some can feel unhappy about it, doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, just think about it, there is no institution, regulatory institution in India, except perhaps arguably for a long time the Reserve Bank, which has had credibility of being impartial. And certainly in no infrastructure sector. And you have seen that neither power nor roads nor real estate has ever taken off. It was telecom which had taken off, and there is no social infrastructure, whether it is medicine, health or education. And it is a national setback, and this is the reason if you don't build credible institutions, if you have things like, if I may use a strong term, regulatory capture, or certainly the collapse of institutions, then who will invest in these long gestation? So it's much, much more, forget idea, forget, at some point of time we have to think as citizens.
As an industry as well, and if I can just go back to Nitin. Nitin, the timing of this is strange because on the one hand, you're discussing ways to try and ease the stress on the telecom sector. I think the last numbers I have access to, that as a whole, about 57% or so of telecom debt was had an interest coverage ratio of less than 1. So one hand, you're trying to improve the picture. On the other hand, you're doing something else. From a credit standpoint, at an industry level, would you say it's negative, sir?
It is certainly negative. We continue to have a negative outlook on the sector. We have, I think, come out in a full circle. We were earlier expecting that some kind of incentives will be given to the industry in the form of increasing the payment terms for the spectrum, lower spectrum usage charges. But now we are facing the situation where incumbents will be losing a lot of EBITDA because of lower termination rates. But I think overall, the industry is moving towards 3 big players, which is Jio, Bharti and Voda Idea combined. The remaining smaller players have, some of them exited, some of them are in the process of exiting. Two of them are, closer to filing bankruptcy. We have already downgraded Reliance Communication to restrictive default. We don't think that there is any recovery coming for the smaller telcos. So I think sooner or later we will be looking at three larger players competing in this market, and Jio will gradually increase its revenue market share from the current position.
You wanted to say something?
Yeah, there's a point which you haven't asked, but I want to mention. The regulator in India by mandate is required to be transparent. And transparency doesn't mean that you take, representations and put them on the website, but your decision making is completely opaque. And opaque is not the word. I mean, it is, it is stubbornly opaque. And
there was a discussion paper that was released on this, and while I know yesterday's order has no explanation.
Even if you take the pure spectrum cost, take nothing else, pure spectrum cost, the cost, and if you apportion it, it will come to at least 8 or 10 paisa. So this is bizarre. And the other thing which I just want to mention is, where are they picking up? They are not accounting experts, the TRAI. Where are they picking up their costs from? Because the cost for terminating a call on VoLTE, voice over long-term evolution, how do you pick it up? There is no profit and loss statement.
You're referring to the current player that has VoLTE, and they have not made available any of their financial details.
There is no profit and loss. And when costs were picked up by the TRAI in earlier years, there was all kinds of accounting reports, certifications, cross-references. You have nothing. And you just, you just take as gospel if someone tells you. So this is, it is, a double standards is an understatement. I don't know what the hell is, how these numbers are, arrived at.
Jaideep, I want you to respond to what Mr. Aga is saying, and also to reiterate Ira's question. On the one hand, we have an interministerial group that's liaising or talking with telecom service providers on how they can alleviate some of the stress on their balance sheets at this point in time. And on the other hand, we have a move by the regulator that will clearly throw into more stress some of these balance sheets because of the IUC shift. So how do you, sort of look at what this means for the sector, and to respond to what Mr. Aga said, does this amount to potential regulatory capture? If you disagree, then it would be interesting to know why you do.
See, I think in terms of why are we in where we are today, and even if you leave out the new operator in Reliance Jio launched last year back, but a large part of the debt has been there for what? I mean, and that's a large part of that is because of the spectrum auctions which have happened over the last 7 years or so. If you leave out last 2 years, spectrum auctions where bidding has been far more, careful and rational, and people have actually not picked up spectrum because of the prices, high, base price and so on and so forth. I think the previous auctions we have seen, and I have personally been, in some of those situations, while we have seen that the bids for, starting with 2010 3G, the so-called 3G auctions, and then subsequently the broadband wireless auctions in 2010. That's when Reliance Jio, not as Reliance Jio, but another organization picked up All India. Those kind of came at exorbitant prices, and people did bid for it. So to sum up, I think it was more the fear of losing or not getting a desired spectrum in a certain band in a certain telecom circle. That kind of directed a lot of those actions.
Jaideep,
so that
forgive me for interrupting, but that's been an argument that's been an argument the industry has made as well for a long time now, that the government has created, maybe for rightful revenue reasons, but it has created an artificial spectrum shortage over the last several years in its allocation and auction policy. Right now, we could debate this forever, but yeah, time is always of essence. So, what do you think will be the net impact on the industry right now? We've discussed the financial impact, and secondly, I also want to ask you, do you see Reliance Jio using this financial relief that they're going to get to further deep discount some of their schemes to consumers, and sort of strike while the iron is hot with the industry, and not attempt to advance its break-even points, because it is a cash-rich organization and has considerable funding from its parents, so it can afford to be loss-making for a period longer?
So Reliance, to your questions, I think they could answer, but they have anyway, without this benefit, also has taken the market in a different way. And please remember, they got the spectrum in 2010, and the launch happened last year. So anyway, about 6 years they waited. Not too many telecom companies would actually launch services after 6 years. So they have deep pockets and they can do, and irrespective of this particular, regulatory testing. This is likely to be challenged, as we also, are hearing. So I cannot comment on what Reliance Jio is going to do, but I think the competitive intensity is very, very high, and we will see, this consolidation is happening, and we will see finally a kind of an equilibrium happening in a few years' time. 2020, making that zero, this is something which I started at the beginning, and that timing, mandating it now or kind of, predicting it now, I think the timing isn't really right. But we will see a fair bit of competitive intensity and then kind of equilibrium in some time. I don't know when. That's very difficult to kind of predict now.
Mr. Aga, is it your fear that Reliance Jio will use this to further deep discount to consumers and not attempt to advance any break-even points, but just attempt to capture market share through this?
Menaka, I don't honestly know. I have no contact with, not just with them,
I'm
but...
not asking you to speak on behalf of Reliance Jio. I'm saying, do you expect that to be the competitive play out?
But a few things. I think they have got themselves, this is just my assessment, they've got themselves into what is called too big to fail kind of, the investment is just too large. And to not just protect the reality, but protect the image that this is a viable becomes a very important requirement. And if I was in that position, and therefore, and one of the things I find is that, a company which is not putting out a profit and loss and many other is holding back certain information, could be for a different set of reasons. But to me, it seems to me that that is a pressure point. That is a pressure point. They have to show that they are invincible, and that is a basis. But I actually don't know. I'm really getting into areas.
Okay. No, I just thought whether you expect this to become a bigger impulse.
I think there'll be two pressures. One is obviously this is going to give them more oxygen to continue. Obviously, so if whatever it was, it gives them a little more. Secondly, at some point of time, how do you not follow Indian accounting standards in spirit? Should have been done, in my opinion, a year ago, is also a question. But I don't know. I mean, all kinds of things happen in India.
And the legal challenge to this?
If I was a judge, unfortunately, I'm not. I would. But Indian courts, particularly in commercial matters, are not as swift and predictable as one would like. So I really don't know.
Yeah, well, you can't be plaintiff and judge. That would be tough to be. But thank you very much for joining us. Sanjeev Aga, Jaideep, Ghosh, Nitin, Soni, thank you for shedding some light on this debate. Let's see what happens to the telecom industry, but we're definitely in for interesting times.
Yeah, tough times for the incumbents if indeed this goes ahead as planned. As we heard, that there might be challenge, but you don't know whether this will pass through or no.
No way to predict what courts do.
Anyways, thanks so much, gentlemen, for joining in today and giving us that perspective.